Hello, and welcome to our quiet historical journey. Today we are delving into the world of 19th century factories, a world that has profoundly influenced the way we understand manufacturing and work today. We will explore their structure, the living conditions of the workers, how these factories change society, and the challenges faced by those who worked in these factories. Try to relax, breathe deeply, and allow yourself to drift into this historical moment where the sounds of modern cities gradually fade away and you are immersed in the quiet but rich stories of the people whose lives were lived in noisy factory environments. Factories in the 19th century were not just production buildings. They were huge machines that transformed labor into goods and goods into profit. Imagine huge buildings filled with the roar of machines and the clatter of work. Every room in these factories was filled with the sounds of work, from the hum of looms to the constant movement of wheels. People worked in conditions that were far from what we are used to seeing in modern factories. All this mechanized power was created with one goal in mind: productivity. But the price for this success was very high. Factories in the 19th century were an integral part of the Industrial Revolution that shook the world. Everything we know about mass production comes from these giant buildings. Every process was strictly organized, and every worker was part of a complex system. However, with this system came its own problems, such as the incredible exploitation of labor, the horrific living conditions, and the hardships that those who worked in these factories faced. Now that we have introduced the factories of the 19th century, let's go back a little further to understand how this whole story began and what exactly caused such powerful but not always friendly centers of production to emerge. Let's smoothly move on to the main events that became the catalyst for the Industrial Revolution. Let me delve a little deeper into this important historical moment, the Industrial Revolution, which forever changed the structure of society and the way we produce. If you close your eyes and imagine how it all began, you can feel how the world around people was changing. It was a time when old, familiar ways of living and working were beginning to give way to new, powerful, and sometimes frightening processes that would govern future generations. The Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain in the late 18th century, was the catalyst for changes that would soon sweep the world. It was a period in which production methods were truly transformed, with machines being invented that didn't just speed up work, they changed the very nature of work. These changes, while they became the foundation of modern society, were also a real challenge for many people. The most important event was when James Watt's steam engine, improved in 1765, began to bear fruit. Although the idea of a steam engine had existed since antiquity, it was Watt's improvement of the steam engine that made it possible to create mechanisms that did not depend on external natural factors such as water flows or windmills. Now, only coal could be used to operate factories, which meant that the location of production became much more flexible. Factories no longer needed rivers or bodies of water to operate. This changed everything, both urban landscapes and people's lives. Imagine a factory that could now be built in any part of the city. These giant buildings became monoliths in the landscape, seemingly motionless and terrifying, but at the same time, they carried the possibility of change. In these places, full of sound waves emitted by machines, mechanisms, and machines, products were produced that the world so lacked. There was much more work, which meant that more and more people were attracted to the factories. Even as these huge factory complexes were being built, another important moment was approaching. More and more people were leaving the countryside, where traditional farm work was becoming less profitable due to mechanization. At the same time, new economic opportunities were emerging in the cities, leaving no choice. Workers flocked to the cities, hoping to find a more stable income. But what did they find there? Noisy, smoky, overcrowded factories, where working conditions were not only difficult, but also dangerous. Over time, factories became centers of attraction for workers. When the steam engine came into use, it began to destroy traditional methods of work, and instead of working in small workshops, people were now forced to perform monotonous work on huge machines that did not allow for individuality. Machines and mechanisms that could work continuously demanded the same from workers. This created a tension that became more noticeable every day. In addition, with the development of the factory system, production accelerated and mass production of goods such as fabrics, clothing, metal, and products needed for railroad construction became possible. The number of jobs also increased, but the price of this speed and productivity was not only the sacrifice of a huge amount of labor, but also the loss of many human qualities. Factory workers began to feel like cogs in a large mechanical system. Their lives were no longer independent. Their every move was now part of a complex and continuous production cycle. It was at this point that society was confronted with a new phenomenon. Rural residents, forced to leave their homes and seek work in the cities, found themselves in unfavorable conditions. This was a time of urbanization, when small villages and towns began to turn into overcrowded factory districts. New buildings were built, but often the people who arrived in these cities found themselves in terrible conditions. The working-class neighborhoods, filled with children and adults, had neither proper sanitation nor adequate comfort. The daily life of these people became a heavy burden that they had to bear in order to earn their daily bread. Every day, factories became centers, not only economic, but also social and even cultural. But there were problems at every step: pollution, noise, poverty, and illness. Workers, especially those who were just starting their working life in factories, faced serious difficulties. Pain and fatigue became inseparable companions of their work. However, despite all these difficult conditions, the Industrial Revolution still brought great changes to the world. Mechanized production provided the growing population with cheap goods, changing the ideas about the possibilities and needs of society. In particular, labor resources became the basis of new production systems. Workers, although they were in difficult conditions, carried on their shoulders new opportunities for economic growth. As we have seen, from the advent of the steam engine in the late 18th century to the first large factories, the Industrial Revolution affected all areas of life: people, technology, and even the environment. This era forced people to work more, and factories became the central points of economic life. But all these changes were accompanied by profound social consequences that led to the emergence of a new class, the working class, whose lives were inextricably linked with machines and factory production. Now that we have taken a deeper look at the events that led to the Industrial Revolution, let's take a look at what these factories looked like. What were they really like? How were the buildings arranged? What processes took place inside? And how did those who worked in these gigantic factories live? Imagine a majestic building standing in the center of a city. It is large and massive, often reminiscent of a fortress, but this fortress does not protect, it produces. It does not radiate peace, but produces an endless noise. If you close your eyes, you can feel the vibrations that penetrate the floors, walls, and sometimes even the air. This is a 19th century factory, a symbol of a new era in industry, an era when production processes were becoming powerful and continuous. Factories, which were becoming more common, took on completely new forms that were radically different from what we are used to seeing today. First of all, it is important to understand that a 19th century factory was not just a place where goods were made. It was a complex system, the mechanisms of which worked in sync to ensure maximum productivity. Factories were divided into several different sections, each of which performed its own role in the production process. These sections, like the buildings themselves, were designed so that the entire system could function smoothly. One of the most characteristic features of the factories of that time is their architecture. These buildings were usually very tall, with several floors. They often had large windows to let as much light as possible into the room where the machines were located. However, the light that came through these windows was far from clean and bright. It was dim, dusty, saturated with smoke and soot that had evaporated from the hot steam engines and machines. Imagine a factory where the bright sun, passing through dusty glass, had difficulty breaking through the dense layer of steam that was constantly hanging in the air. The sun's rays seemed unable to find a way through all this smoke and sweat, leaving the rooms dim and darkened. As you approached the factory, you could hear the rumble of machinery that was a constant companion to these industries. Inside, on each floor, there were huge machines, most of which were powered by steam. The machines did more than just perform their function. They created an atmosphere of tension and anxiety. In the center of these gigantic rooms stood the steam engines, around which were located smaller machines, weaving looms, mechanisms for the production of fabrics and other goods. The machines were huge and heavy. Sometimes their parts were covered in rust because they worked without stopping. Each of these machines made its own distinctive sound, from knocking and rumbling to the grinding of metal. Every movement of the machines in these spacious rooms created its own symphony, where all the elements merged into a single rhythm, reminding us that all of this was part of a large system that could not stop. The working conditions inside the factory left much to be desired. Dust, the resinous smell of hot metal, and the sharp smell of coal soot filled the air. For those who were there, this was something normal. The working day passed amid noise, dust, and constant movement. There was not enough fresh air, and the ventilation left much to be desired. Sunlight barely penetrated inside, creating a feeling of semi-darkness that did not give rest to the eyes and mind. But beyond the sounds and smells, it's worth considering how people worked in these conditions. Workers were located on every floor of the factory, and their movements had to be synchronized with the work of the machines. Imagine the men, women, and children who bore the brunt of the work, moving between giant machines, constantly checking their performance, fixing faults, and monitoring the process. Working in such conditions required not only physical strength, but also endurance. But few of them could have imagined that their lives, and often their health, were becoming part of an endless production process. The peculiarity of working in 19th century factories also consisted in the fact that there was often no workplace. Workers generally occupied their places near the machines, and their time was subordinated to the rhythm of production. Even during lunch breaks, they remained in close proximity to the machines. Workers also lived in factory apartments located nearby, and life in such places was not easy. The spaces in such houses were often cramped and poorly lit, and the ventilation was terrible. All this made the working conditions even more difficult, especially considering that workers often spent 12 to 14 hours a day at the factory. These factories also had a kind of discipline. Workers were required to keep the equipment running and follow certain rules set by the owners. But, as is often the case in such conditions, many jobs were supervised by supervisors who made sure that the process did not stop. Sometimes the supervisors used strict control methods to prevent the workers from losing momentum. And so, be that as it may, each workday turned into a process where time lost its significance and all attention was focused on the mechanisms and production processes. It's worth remembering that the manufacturing process itself, from raw materials to finished goods, was also cleverly organized. Factories often used a variety of methods to transport materials within the factory, which also required complex logistics. Carts carrying materials would roll along the floor, or they would be moved by large winches and hoists. The complex system of moving materials and finished products around the factory was part of what made factories so productive. However, despite the enormous scale of these industries, it is worth emphasizing that the factories of the 19th century were not only symbols of progress, but also the embodiment of many socio-economic problems. Working conditions were terrible, and for workers these were real trials. Workers were forced to sacrifice their freedom and personal time to produce the goods that ensured economic growth. But, despite the hard work, many workers did not have the opportunity to improve their lives. And here again the same paradox arises. Technological progress, on the one hand, moved the world forward, on the other. It made the lives of workers hard and monotonous. Thus, the factories of the 19th century were not just industrial objects, but entire worlds filled with human labor, mechanical processes, and social tensions. They not only defined the way of life of an entire generation of people, but also left their mark on history as symbols of the time when the world merged with machines and people became part of this inexorable machine of production. To understand how 19th century factories affected people, we need to look not only at the manufacturing process itself, but also at the labor market that emerged in response to the demands of new, mechanized production. The 19th century labor market was unique because it was not as flexible as we are used to seeing today. It was a market where supply and demand were often tightly constrained, where the economy was fast but brutal, and where the working class was forced to adapt to a rapidly changing world in which their jobs were often neither fulfilling nor secure. The mass migration of people to cities was an integral part of the Industrial Revolution. Rural populations, previously engaged in agriculture, began to move rapidly to industrial centers in search of work. This movement was driven by economic necessity. As agriculture became more mechanized, farmers lost their land, and opportunities for earning money in the countryside became increasingly limited. At the same time, new factories that began to appear in cities offered jobs, albeit with difficult working conditions. Throughout the 19th century, cities such as Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool experienced a veritable storm of urbanization, which led to overcrowding and increased social tensions. The workers who came to the cities were often unhoused and unskilled. Their work often required little more than physical strength and the ability to operate monotonous and mechanized machines. Factories needed hands that could keep the machines running smoothly, as every stop meant a loss of money and time. At the same time, factory owners sought to keep costs as low as possible, which meant that workers, especially those without experience, could count on low wages. Most workers, especially women and children, received wages that did not cover even the most basic needs. The men, women, and children who worked in factories formed a completely new social structure that had not existed before. Men tended to do the more physically demanding jobs, such as operating heavy machinery or building the factory itself. However, women and children formed the bulk of the workforce in many factories, especially in the textile industry. They performed repetitive work, such as spinning and weaving, that required dexterity but not strength. Their work was often poorly paid and extremely exhausting. Women and children often worked for less than men, reflecting the widespread exploitation and social inequality of the time. Imagine a factory full of people working from dawn to dusk, performing the same, endlessly repetitive tasks. The working conditions were far from ideal, with poor ventilation, poor lighting, and tight controls. However, for many of these people, this work was the only way to provide for themselves and their families. A person who ended up in a factory exposed himself not only to physical exhaustion, but also to mental exhaustion, since working hours that went beyond the limits of human endurance became common practice in many industries. An important element of the 19th century labor market was how this labor force was used and distributed in factories. Labor could be roughly divided into several categories: skilled and unskilled. Skilled labor required workers to have certain skills, which allowed them to earn more. However, such workers were relatively few in number, and they often did more complex work that required skill and training. Unskilled workers, in turn, received much lower wages, and their lives were an endless struggle for survival. By this time, mechanisms began to play an increasingly important role in the labor market, which not only accelerated the production process, but also displaced many people from traditional jobs. Mechanized machines, such as inventions like steam, spinning machines, and weaving looms, became much more efficient than manual labor. In this context, man was no longer the sole engine of production. Now, his task was to support and control the work of machines. Workers, tired of monotonous work, no longer considered themselves masters of their craft. They became part of a larger system where, instead of their personal qualifications or skills, only the process of work was important, and not the labor itself as a creative act. For most workers in the 19th century, existence was harsh and mechanical. They lived on the edge of poverty, and even if they were able to work, they could not hope for better living conditions. Workers often lived in crowded and dirty apartments located near factories, which were as uncomfortable as the factory buildings themselves. These neighborhoods were packed with people, including workers' families, who suffered from malnutrition, disease, and poor sanitation. Diseases such as tuberculosis, cholera, and diarrhea were common in these densely populated areas, and life in these conditions was often short and miserable. An important element of factory work was not only the fact that workers created products, but also how they were organized within the production process. The working classes, despite their poverty and exploitation, did not remain passive. As the number of factories and workers grew, people began to realize the need to organize. Strikes and protests, although suppressed, became part of everyday reality, and gradually the idea of the workers' right to decent working conditions began to take shape in society. For factory owners, these strikes and protests were a serious problem, as they could slow down the production process. On the other hand, workers could not continue to live in conditions of constant exploitation. The working day, which often began at 5 or 6 in the morning and ended only at night, was unbearable, and people began to realize that they had to fight for their rights. This process of fighting for the rights of the working class, labor legislation, and the first laws to protect workers became an important stage in the 19th century development of a society that, several decades later, would begin to introduce restrictions on the length of the working day and improve working conditions. As a result, the 19th century labor market became an arena for social and economic interaction, where everyone who came to work in factories had to accept the role of part of a larger system. Workers, despite their exploitation, became important figures in this market. The desire for more humane working conditions became their driving force, and the first steps towards change began to be made in this era. Thus, the labor market of the 19th century was not simply a place where labor was exchanged for wages. It was a complex and multifaceted system in which the interests of workers, manufacturers, government, and society intersected. It was a system in which every day, every minute, was worth more than just money, and in which each worker was part of a huge machine that moved progress forward. A working day in a 19th century factory was brutal and tiring, a continuous series of repetitive actions with no room for personal experiences or breaks. Picture this time. You wake up early in the morning, before dawn, in a house located near the factory, in a room filled with smoke and the smell of food that cannot hide the smell of dirty and damp walls. The workday begins at 5 or 6 in the morning, and you have no choice but to hurry so as not to be late. Your job is to be at the factory as early as possible, because time is money, and for the factory owners, every moment of downtime was too expensive. When workers arrived at the factory, they had no time to spare for anything personal. They walked through dark, dirty corridors lit by dim lights and headed to their workstations, where the sounds of machines and the smell of oil became their constant companions. Factory workers had no time for long breaks, and every moment of their day was scheduled according to the work they were doing. Morning and afternoon breaks were short, hardly more than 10 minutes. Some factories allowed a short lunch break, but even this was so compressed that workers barely had time to eat before heading back to their machines. Workers, especially in the textile mills, were engaged in extremely monotonous and exhausting work. They processed yarn and fabric on huge rattling machines, their hands making the same movements hundreds of times a day. Imagine a person who, for 12, 14, or more hours a day, operates a huge machine that has neither soul nor sympathy. Each movement of the worker is no more than a small part of the machine, striving for its goal, the production of cloth or other goods. From the very beginning of the working day, the workers stood up, trying to start working as quickly as possible, because in factories, it was very important to keep up the pace. Every delay, every distraction meant a loss of time and money. If someone failed to switch the machine in time, or if the mechanism malfunctioned, the overseers immediately punished the workers. This was not just work. It was the fulfillment of a role in a huge invisible system where each person was part of the mechanism, and his own time and effort were perceived as material units that had their own price. The working day was so long and hard that physical pain became an integral part of every worker's life. Many workers, especially women and children, were engaged in sedentary but no less exhausting work. The yarn or fabric had to be laid out in a certain way, with minimal deviations. These processes required constant attention and concentration, as well as endurance from fatigue and pain in the body. The hands, tired and sore from monotonous work, could not find solace, and the workers continued to move in a circle. Work, rest, again, work. The noise in such rooms was unbearable. Textile machines, steam engines, and other mechanisms created walls of sound that rumbled incessantly. It was not just irritating, it was physically noticeable. The endless noise and vibrations of factory equipment left no peace or ability to concentrate. Often it was necessary to work in rooms where the air was saturated with coal dust, soot, and even fumes from the materials being processed, which worsened working conditions and health. The health of workers, however, was not considered valuable in those years. Workers were often considered expendable and could be easily replaced. This is confirmed by the horrific facts that in many factories, workers suffered from diseases caused by prolonged overload and poor conditions. The workers' lungs often suffered from pneumoconiosis, a disease caused by prolonged inhalation of dust. Many of those who worked in factories did not live to old age, and life in these factory machines became not only unbearable, but also deadly. An important feature of the working day in the factory was that the worker could not stop working at any time, as he wished. Unlike work in the field, where there was more freedom of choice, the factory dictated strict rules. Workers could not leave the machine, even if their health suffered or if they were tired. Tired, exhausted, they continued to work, because in factories there were only two choices: either continue working or lose your job. And in the conditions of high competition in the labor market, even the loss of one working day could mean the most serious consequences. In between work processes, despite the monotony of the work, many workers tried to relax for at least a few minutes, although it was almost impossible in such conditions. Some factories did not even have conditions for normal food or rest, and workers ate in semi-dark rooms next to dirty mechanisms. There were factories that did not provide canteens, and workers ate right at their workplaces, and such places were so cramped that their lunch was a routine part of the work process. In addition to physical suffering, the working day was also accompanied by constant mental stress. Workers were forced to obey the strict rules of factory owners and overseers, and any attempts to express discontent were brutally suppressed. Protests and strikes, which arose in many factories, were rare and, as a rule, were brutally suppressed by police forces or hired guards. Workers oppressed by the system could not count on support in the fight for their rights. The only way to survive was to continue working, no matter how hard and painful it was. So, a working day in a 19th century factory was not only a physical, but also a mental test. The workers, living in conditions where personal space was limited and endurance was tested to the limit, had no opportunity to rest and recuperate. For them, every morning became a real test, and every day, endless labor. The workers in the factories of that time could not afford to stop, because every moment of downtime in the factory was expensive, and the very fact that they worked at such a production level made them dependent on the power and control of the factory owners. Working conditions in 19th century factories were perhaps some of the harshest imaginable. To be immersed in this atmosphere is to find yourself in a world where every day is a struggle against physical fatigue, illness, and severe restrictions that leave no choice. It was not just a job, it was a test of endurance, where the most important quality is the ability to endure and not break. Let's now take a closer look at what these conditions looked like and what they meant for the people who were in this environment. First of all, it is worth noting that 19th century factories had an absolute monoculture of work. This meant that workers spent entire days doing the same type of actions, and they repeated them dozens, if not hundreds of times per shift. Whether it was working on looms, on wool processing machines, or on heavier factory machinery, the work was extremely monotonous, which certainly took a toll on people's physical and psychological well-being. Imagine working 12, sometimes 14 hours a day, and during that time, you had to perform the same movement over and over again, hour after hour, day after day. Your arms and back, it would start to ache, but you had to keep working anyway, because otherwise you could be fired, which would mean you would end up in poverty. But single manifold work was not the only problem. The working conditions in factories were truly brutal. The most obvious factor that put workers in a very uncomfortable position was their physical proximity to dangerous machines. These machines often ran at high speeds, and their power left workers with little chance of escape if they were caught in the machinery. And while modern industrial safety standards now require protective screens and guards on such machines, in the 19th century such safety measures simply did not exist. Workers, especially those who worked with textile machines, could easily become caught in them. This was not uncommon. Injuries, cuts, broken bones. All of these were part of the reality of factory life. But injuries weren't the only problem. Workers who were around machines were subjected to enormous physical stress. The machines didn't just rumble, they created a soundscape that left no chance for peace and quiet. Imagine working your entire shift, surrounded by constant noise that literally swallowed your perception. For many people, this noise became the norm. While modern factories are equipped with effective noise protection, in the factories of the 19th century, they did not exist. The constant rumble and vibration from the working mechanisms could cause workers severe headaches, fatigue, and even hearing loss. Over time, all this led to damage to the nervous system, which is why many factory workers became immune to pain and fatigue. In addition to noise and vibration, one of the main factors worsening working conditions was the incredible dirt and dust. The production process in many factories, especially textile factories, generated huge amounts of dust that settled in the air. This was not just dust, but dirt saturated with particles of wool, oil, and other production materials. Workers often breathed this dust, which led to respiratory diseases, the most common of which was pneumoconiosis, a disease caused by prolonged inhalation of dust. Not only did factory buildings often lack ventilation, but the windows, which in those years were often small and closed, did not allow in fresh air, necessary for normal oxygen exchange. The air quality inside the factories was deplorable. Not only dust, but chemical fumes from textile processing, machine oils and grease, and combustion products from coal-fired furnaces permeated the premises, creating a toxic atmosphere that not only worsened the physical health of the workers, but also reduced their vitality. As a result, many factory workers suffered from constant shortness of breath, and those who had worked in the factory for several years often suffered from lung damage and chronic diseases that even modern medical treatments could not treat. The physical working conditions were also a problem. In the 19th century, factories were often located in dilapidated buildings with low ceilings, which gave the premises a depressing appearance. Lighting in these rooms was minimal, as the windows were often small or boarded up. The light that came through them could hardly illuminate the entire work process, as clouds of dust and smoke from the furnaces obscured the sun's rays. Some factory rooms were so dark that workers needed artificial lighting, but its quality was extremely poor. This lack of light impaired the workers' vision and forced them to work in conditions where their eyes began to tire from the strain. The workers' living conditions also left much to be desired. Many of those who worked in factories lived in dark, cramped rooms located near the production facilities. These apartments were often located in shabby buildings, where living quarters were shared between several families. The population density was so high that even simple movement in these apartments became a real problem. These rooms were extremely uncomfortable and stuffy. Workers who worked 12 to 14 hours a day could not even count on a normal rest at the end of the workday. They came home only to sleep a little, and then went back to the factory, where the conditions were no better. Moreover, the wages that workers received barely covered the most basic needs. Women and children who worked in factories received even less pay than men. This created a severe social inequality, where the labor of people working in the same conditions did not bring them either decent compensation or respect. Such people lived in a constant sense of instability, because even the slightest illness or injury could lead them to poverty. There was no healthcare system, and, as a rule, workers could not afford treatment. Diseases became commonplace, and treatment became an expensive luxury that workers could not afford. As difficult as the working conditions were, they had another, more sinister aspect: psychological. The constant pressure from factory owners and overseers, the endless strain of physical work, and the atmosphere of fear that arose from strict factory regulations made the workers' work unbearably difficult, not only physically, but also mentally. Workers were obliged to follow every order, with no room for error, and breaking the rules could lead to fines or dismissal. Thus, each working day was filled with labor that not only destroyed the body, but also broke the soul. Factories of the 19th century were not just places of work, but real factories for the destruction of human life. They took away people's health, time, and human dignity, subjecting them to strict rules and conditions where their lives did not matter. The wages of workers in 19th century factories were one of the most painful topics of that time. It was an element that included not only the material needs of people, but also a whole range of social, economic, and moral problems. The wages that workers received were so low that many of them could barely feed themselves and their loved ones. The time when working conditions were almost inhumane, and wages did not cover even the minimum needs, became a time of mass exploitation of workers, when labor became so cheap that human life lost its value. For many workers, 19th century factories were their last chance to make a living. But those who accepted a job in a factory inevitably faced a harsh reality. The pay was meager, and the work had to be done in conditions that were in no way compensated for by the money. In most factories, the worker received a wage that was so low that it often did not cover even the most basic needs: food, clothing, and shelter. Sometimes workers earned no more than a few shillings a week, which was not enough to eat properly, let alone maintain their health, which, as we have already mentioned, was deteriorating due to the harsh working conditions. This level of wage meant that workers lived in constant poverty and were dependent on any work they could find. Moreover, even if the worker behaved honestly and diligently, his situation did not improve. In most factories, workers were paid daily or weekly, depending on the number of hours worked. But this method of payment also left workers with no room for maneuver. The more hours worked, the fewer days off, and consequently, the worker received less rest and recovery. For example, In textile factories, where the work was especially harsh and monotonous, workers often did not even have time for a good night's sleep. The workday lasted 12 to 14 hours, and days off were extremely rare. In such a schedule, work became a draining process that left almost no room for personal life, and the pay for such exhausting work was negligible. Women and children working in factories were also subjected to even more brutal exploitation. Because their work was considered less skilled, their pay was even lower than that of men. Women working in factories typically received between 10 and 50% of a man's salary for the same work. This was not just a social inequality, but also another confirmation of the enormous exploitation that flourished in factories. Even if a woman performed similar tasks as a man, her efforts were not rewarded adequately. Children, like women, were also paid much less than their colleagues, but child labor in factories was no less tiring and dangerous. Many children worked 12 hours a day, receiving a pittance in exchange for their labor. All this led to the fact that children, instead of being protected in their childhood, became full-fledged laborers in childhood, often deprived of even the most basic education and the opportunity to play or rest. The wage system in 19th century factories was not only unfair, but also extremely demoralizing. Workers who performed hard physical labor in brutally exploitative conditions received very little pay for their work. This created constant tension in society because people who devoted their entire lives to factories could not provide themselves with basic needs such as housing, food, and clothing. No matter how much they worked, no matter how hard they tried, their lives did not improve, but on the contrary became more and more difficult. Wages in 19th century factories were not only linked to the number of hours a worker worked, but also to a specific payment schedule set by the factory owners. In many cases, pay was dependent on how efficiently production targets were met. If a worker failed to meet the target, his pay could be reduced, despite the fact that he worked in terrible conditions. Unlike today, where workers usually have a fixed salary, in the 19th century, most workers were paid on a piecework system. This meant that their income depended on the amount of goods produced. However, this system could hardly be considered fair, since the working conditions were such that even the most diligent workers could not expect a pay increase. Rather, the harder they tried, the more was demanded of them. A worker who failed to meet the target was immediately punished or fined, which further oppressed him and made his work meaningless. For those who worked in factories and industrial centers such as Manchester or Liverpool, the wage situation was no less brutal. Despite these cities being the centers of the Industrial Revolution, the workers' living conditions remained appalling. Many lived in squalid flats that were cramped and dirty. There was little chance of enjoying life, as the money they earned was spent on food and basic necessities. Often workers were forced to choose between food and clothing, leading to poverty and chronic malnutrition. It was a reality in which the daily struggle for survival became the only meaning in life. The wage situation led to social instability and mass discontent among workers. Workers who had lived in hopelessness for a long time began to organize. Already in the middle of the 19th century, the first mass protests of workers began to break out in Great Britain, related to working conditions and low wages. This was the time when the first protests and strikes appeared, which became important steps in the history of the labor movement. Workers began to realize that without fighting for their rights, they would not be able to improve their lives. This eventually led to the creation of labor unions and the activation of social movements, which in the future played an important role in improving working conditions. The wages of workers in the factories of the 19th century were extremely low and unfair. But even in these conditions, people found the strength to fight for their lives and strive for a better future. This struggle was not easy, and many of them could not survive the terrible conditions in which they had to work. However, their work and efforts became the basis for those changes that later led to improved working conditions and the creation of the first social guarantees for workers. Workers in 19th century factories held a variety of positions and performed a variety of tasks. But all of these jobs had one thing in common. They involved heavy physical labor and repetitive actions. Factory jobs of that era did not require complex skills, but they did require incredible stamina and patience. Factories were organized in such a way that all workers, regardless of gender or age, had to perform mechanical, repetitive work, following strict standards and schedules. So, although factory jobs were divided into several categories, all of these jobs were interconnected within the overall system of the production process. In many factories, especially in the textile industry, the jobs of workers could be divided into several categories: mechanics, machine operators, fitters, and lower-skilled workers. One of the most common types of jobs were operators, who worked directly with machines. These workers did not require special qualifications and could be hired with minimal skills. However, their work, despite the lack of complex theoretical training, was exhausting, since every day they had to work with mechanical devices that, as a rule, did not have even basic safety equipment. Mechanics and fitters were slightly more senior in the factory, as their jobs required specific skills and knowledge. Mechanics maintained the steam engines that were the main source of power in factories, while fitters performed tasks that repaired and maintained the metal parts of the factory machinery. While these jobs required more knowledge and skill, they also paid higher wages than other jobs, although they were still within the poverty wage bracket. Even workers with these specialties often received wages that were far from adequate compensation for their skills and work. In addition, there were often workers in factories who could be classified as helpers or assistants. These workers performed auxiliary functions in factories, such as delivering materials, cleaning work areas, loading and unloading raw materials, and monitoring machines and installations. These types of workers often had less complex tasks, but they were still subject to the same brutal exploitation as more experienced workers. They were paid the lowest wages in the factory, and their working conditions were the most inconvenient. Even these workers were often subject to strict supervision by supervisors, who made sure that they did not stay late and completed their work as quickly as possible. However, an important aspect of factory work was that male, female, and child laborers performed the same tasks. For example, in textile factories, men, women, and children worked on the same machines, weaving, spinning, and packing the finished product. The only difference was that women and children were paid significantly less than men, despite the fact that the amount of work and the difficulty of the work were equal. Women performed the same monotonous and physically exhausting tasks as men, but their work was not valued. Workers, regardless of gender, were expected to perform their tasks in a strict order, serving long shifts without adequate rest, which had an extremely negative impact on their physical and mental health. Children working in factories were especially vulnerable in this process. They did the same jobs as adults, but their small bodies could not handle the same stresses. Children were often hired to work in smaller, safer areas, such as cleaning machines or feeding yarn, but this did not make their work any easier. Factory work for children typically meant long hours without respite, poor nutrition, and conditions that were detrimental to their health. Many children suffered from chronic illnesses, became so tired that they could no longer work, and others were injured on dangerous machines. There were also jobs in factories that could be called intermediate, where not only physical strength, but also the ability to manage a process was needed. These were, for example, foremen or supervisors who made sure that workers completed their work on time and with the required intensity. Foremen in this context occupied slightly higher positions than ordinary workers, but they were still subject to the same exploitative conditions and worked under conditions of high stress and control. Supervisors, although they occupied higher positions, still had duties that required them to be tough and act quickly. They supervised thousands of workers, and often their only task was to make sure that the workers completed their duties quickly and without hesitation. However, despite the harsh conditions, factory jobs still played an important role in the country's economy. Factories were not just production complexes. They were small worlds where labor and products were exchanged. The workers in these factories became part of a huge production machine that turned at great speed, without stopping, providing products for the whole society. Every person, regardless of their profession, contributed to this process, and each day in the factory became an integral part of a system that, in essence, did not allow time for reflection or emotion. The work was all-encompassing and meaningless in the sense that it left no room for personal ambitions or dreams. The difficulty of factory jobs was also that workers could not expect their conditions to improve. The principle of work in factories was based on fierce competition. The more workers came to the factories, the more competition there was between them for positions. Workers who could not meet the demands of the factory owners were forced to leave their place and look for work elsewhere. This process of constant replacement of workers, despite their endurance, only increased exploitation. Therefore, the jobs in 19th century factories, despite their apparent normality, were filled not only with work, but also with a feeling of helplessness, hopelessness, and a constant struggle for a place in a system that was not set up to improve conditions for those who created all this progress. The jobs in 19th century factories, then, were not simply a set of roles performed for profit. They were a system in which workers' labor was highly valued, but they themselves, as people, had no value. Their job was to work beyond their responsibilities and to be part of a larger process that led to only one outcome: economic growth, but not improvements in the living conditions of those who provided it. Child workers in the 19th century factories became an important part of the production system, and their labor was not only widespread, but also vital to the functioning of the Industrial Revolution. In this context, their role in factories was particularly tragic, as working conditions for children were perhaps among the most brutal and merciless. They were literally used as expendable material that brought profit to the factory owners, but received nothing in return. Over the decades, children became a symbol not only of the economic, but also of the social exploitation that flourished in the factories of that time. Children working in factories were often forced to work from a very early age. By the age of 10 to 12, they were already taking part in the production process, which was, in fact, a real test for them. For factory owners, child labor was extremely profitable. Children, unlike adults, could do easier work, for which they were paid significantly less. In addition, they were considered more amenable to training, and it was easier to handle them since they could not resist the working conditions that were offered. Sometimes children worked even 12 to 14 hours a day, and this became the norm for them because they were not allowed to think about what could be better. For children, this was not just work, but real hard labor, devoid of any meaning. Child labor in factories was not easy. In textile factories, for example, children often worked in workshops with heavy mechanical machines that were powered by steam engines. These machines were extremely dangerous. Children often fell into them, receiving serious injuries such as amputations, burns, and even fatal injuries. The machines worked at high speed, and the slightest mistake or fatigue could lead to catastrophic consequences. Child workers had no training in operating the machines, and their task was limited to preparing materials for the machines or assembling finished products. And they did not always understand the dangers that lurked in these mechanisms. In addition, children had to work in conditions of poor ventilation and lighting. In factory workshops, which were crowded with machines, the air was filled with dust and the lighting was extremely low. Many factories of that time did not even have windows or used small, poorly lit spaces. The workday was so long that children were rarely allowed out, and when they were, it was only for a short meal. Rest was usually minimal, and the time spent at the machines was exhausting. The work of these children was not only exhausting, it was destructive to their health, and many died young from chronic fatigue, diseases caused by polluted air, or injuries. The situation with child labor in factories was particularly painful because young children had to work in extremely unfavorable conditions. They did not receive the necessary nutrition, which led to exhaustion and the development of diseases. Children working in factories often suffered from respiratory diseases caused by dust and dirt in the air, as well as pain in the back, legs, and arms. Some children also experienced constant headaches, since the working conditions were so stressful that even their mental state was at risk. These children were unable to receive a normal education, since their lives were completely devoted to work and not to learning. Children usually entered the factories at the age of 6 or 7, if not earlier, and continued to work there until their strength was exhausted. During this time, their families were forced to accept any work in order to feed themselves. The payments they received for the children's labor could not cover basic needs. In the families that sent their children to the factories, poverty was the norm. Children often worked in terrible conditions and refused to go to school because without their labor, the family could not survive. The women and men working in the factories could at least somehow defend their rights by organizing strikes and protests. But the children, in turn, had neither the opportunity to defend their interests, nor any understanding of what was happening to them. They worked without the slightest hope for change. The working conditions were so cruel that children began to die from fatigue, injuries, and illnesses. But despite this, the system of child labor continued to exist, because child labor was an important element in the economy of the factories. However, starting in the late 19th century, when the first laws aimed at protecting children began to appear, the situation began to gradually change. Activists and human rights defenders began to fight for better working conditions, for limiting working hours for children, and for providing them with the opportunity to receive an education. Laws restricting child labor began to be adopted in various countries, but the fight for children's rights was long and difficult. Only after several decades did child work in factories begin to disappear, and children were given the opportunity to go to school and develop in safer and more favorable conditions. Thus, children in the 19th century factories became part of a large production mechanism, where they were attracted because of cheap labor. For them, work was not just hard labor, but real hard labor, which destroyed their health and deprived them of their childhood. Children who worked in factories became a symbol of industrial exploitation, and in the future, their fate became a catalyst for changes in legislation and social policy. The health and safety of workers in 19th century factories was a relatively minor concern in the face of rapid industrial growth and profit maximization. The Industrial Revolution was the engine of economic progress during this era, but it also caused widespread human suffering and tragedy. Factory workers were essentially a resource for owners, and their health was seen as secondary, not worthy of attention or concern. Lack of basic safety standards, non-existent sanitation, and unprecedented physical strain became the norm for those who worked in factories. The most severe consequences for the workers' health were caused not only by the working conditions themselves, but also by the length of the working day. Workers spent 12 to 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, at the factory, without adequate time for rest or recovery. This put their bodies on the brink of exhaustion, and exhausted them not only physically, but also mentally. Not only was their physical health at risk, but the workers' psychological state suffered from constant stress. The inability to break out of this vicious circle of work and fatigue led to depression and other mental disorders. One of the main problems that workers faced was the excessive strain on their bodies. Long hours, little rest, and the constant stress of operating heavy machinery or performing monotonous, repetitive tasks drained their strength. Unlike modern workplaces where there are mandatory rest breaks and maximum working hours, workers in 19th century factories had no such privileges. In most cases, their main rest was a short time that they could use for lunch, although they could not always afford a full meal. The machinery that workers operated was extremely dangerous. Textile factories, for example, use large machines such as looms that could easily cause injury if mishandled, or if a worker became trapped in the machinery. The machines had no protective screens or barriers, and many workers fell victim to these machines. The injury statistics were horrific. Amputations of arms and legs, burns, cuts, and other injuries were common in factories. Workers, especially women and children, were at an incredibly high risk of being trapped under the machines or in other parts of the factory machinery. Sanitary conditions in factories also left much to be desired. Most factory buildings did not have modern water supply or sewage systems. Workers used lunch breaks to eat food in cramped and poorly lit rooms, where there were often no normal sanitary conditions. Dirt, mice, rats, and garbage became constant companions in factories. The lack of clean water, sanitary facilities, and even basic hygiene led to mass illnesses among workers. Epidemics of colds, infections, and intestinal diseases were a constant threat. In such conditions, people's lives were extremely fragile, and any small failure in health could lead to tragedy. In addition, under the factory system, workers often suffered from the effects of chronic fatigue. Long hours, fatigue, and lack of rest led to what was known as burnout, a condition in which a person lost the ability to concentrate and was physically and emotionally unable to cope with the workload. Factory workers were forced to work to the point of exhaustion, and many died from overwork or chronic illness. Their lives were so cruelly limited by time that even if they survived their youth, they had no prospects for the future, except to die at an early age from diseases caused by factory work. For a long time, working conditions were not regulated by law, and workers' health was left in the hands of factory owners themselves, who were generally not interested in improving sanitary or safe conditions unless it directly affected productivity. Since factory owners sought to maximize profits at minimal cost, spending on worker safety and health was considered unnecessary. Therefore, they ignored demands for better conditions until complaints or mass strikes by workers began to come in. When the first labor protection laws began to appear, they were associated with political pressure and protests aimed at drawing attention to social injustice. Legislative changes such as the Factory Labor Acts began to be implemented only in the mid-19th century. These laws regulated working hours, minimum safety conditions, and limited child labor, but even then, many factory conditions remained unsatisfactory for workers. The laws gradually improved the situation, but overall, the struggle for better working conditions continued for many years. Today, thanks to advances in medicine, industrial safety, and workers' rights, we can appreciate the horrific conditions that 19th century workers faced. These changes were only possible through persistent struggles that included not only worker protests, but also civic activism to protect human rights and improve living conditions. The history of factory labor reminds us of the importance of safety, sanitation, and health standards in any workplace. Thus, working conditions in 19th century factories were brutal and dangerous. Workers were exposed to numerous risks, from injuries and illnesses to fatigue and moral exhaustion. This was the price society paid for the Industrial Revolution, and only over time, after much suffering and effort, were laws introduced that began to change this order. But even with the passage of these laws, the fight for workers' rights continued. Social problems among workers in 19th century factories were an integral part of their daily lives. Factory workers, who made up the bulk of the working population in industrial cities, faced incredible difficulties. And these problems were not limited to harsh working conditions. They extended to all aspects of life, including housing, family relationships, social status, and even the mental state of people who, despite their hard work, could not find a worthy place in society. One of the main social problems was poverty. Workers lived on wages that barely covered the most basic needs. While the Industrial Revolution led to economic growth and increased wealth for factory owners, workers lived in dire poverty. The wages they received for backbreaking labor were barely enough to cover food and clothing, and sometimes even that was not enough. Workers lived in cramped and uncomfortable apartments, often without basic amenities. In these conditions, there was no room for comfort or safety. Instead, people lived in a constant struggle for survival. Living conditions for factory workers were extremely harsh. Workers' quarters, especially in the larger industrial cities, were overcrowded. Many workers and their families lived in small rooms, often without adequate ventilation or light. Many lived in houses that had been built too quickly and without regard for sanitary standards, which led to their rapid collapse. These quarters were places of accumulation of poverty and hopelessness. Not only did workers face unfavorable conditions inside their homes, but the areas themselves were dirty and contaminated. In places like Manchester, Liverpool, and Birmingham, the number of cases of disease increased and the death rate among working families increased. In addition, large numbers of workers, especially women and children, lived in houses that had no access to drinking water or sanitation. This meant that filth and disease spread at an incredible rate. Infectious diseases such as cholera, smallpox, and tuberculosis flourished in such conditions, killing hundreds and thousands of people. The workers' quarters were so overcrowded that even moving around them was a real challenge. Many families lived in one room, and the living conditions in such conditions led to even deeper social inequality. Those who suffered from diseases could not afford treatment and usually died quickly. Social inequality in the factories was multifaceted. In addition to poverty and poor housing, workers faced severe social contempt. The working class had no right to education, cultural development, or even respect from the higher strata of society. Workers were largely isolated from the rest of society. There was a clear barrier between them and those who belonged to the upper strata, such as factory owners, business owners, or even wealthier city dwellers. Workers, no matter how hard they tried, often had no opportunity to improve their situation, and their lives were tied to factory conditions that robbed them of any opportunities for social mobility. The problem was particularly acute among women and children. Women who worked in factories not only received minimum wages, but also suffered significant social inequality. Not only did they have to work for less than men, but they also had the added disadvantage of not being seen as equal. Women and children were also the most vulnerable workers. Their labor was cheaper, and they were less protected from exploitation. Child labor in factories was not only physically exhausting, but also socially destructive. Children typically worked in unfavorable conditions, deprived of education and normal social connections. The social isolation of workers was not limited to their poverty or lack of education. Workers lived in a world of great social tension. Because workers were so poorly paid, their lives were a never-ending struggle for survival, and often these people could not afford rest or even adequate food. Working families, despite having many children, could not provide their children with basic benefits such as education, health, and safety. Many children were forced to work from an early age, without the opportunity to play, rest, or simply have a childhood. In such conditions, socialization was limited to a minimum. The psychological pressure on workers was also great. Under constant stress, exhausting work, and social isolation, many workers could not cope with the increasing pressure. Many people suffered from mental illnesses such as depression, anxiety, and nervous disorders. The stress caused by the inability to change their lives, low wages, and difficult working conditions was almost unbearable. The psychological consequences of this system began to affect people, and gradually workers began to fight for better working and living conditions. Families of workers also suffered from a lack of education and opportunities for normal development. Most children of workers began working at the age of 6 to 8, and their education was reduced to a minimum. Educational institutions were available only to children from wealthier families, and this created serious social inequality. Most children did not know what a normal childhood, play, and rest were. Working children began working instead of studying, and continued to work all their lives, never having the opportunity to change their fate. Their existence was tied to the factory, and they could not afford to dream of a better life. Thus, the social problems among workers in the factories of the 19th century were multifaceted and dire. Workers were forced to live in conditions of extreme poverty, facing inequality, lack of education, health care, and decent living conditions. Their lives were cruel and limited, and they had no real opportunities to change their fate. These problems became the basis for the struggle for workers' rights, which later led to the emergence of the first labor laws, improved social conditions, and recognition of human rights to a decent life. The housing conditions of workers in the 19th century were one of the most painful and cruel aspects of life for the industrial masses. Workers, despite the fact that they worked for the benefit of the Industrial Revolution, lived in conditions that were in themselves a threat to their health and life. Factories, which became the main engines of economic growth, did not provide their workers with the opportunity to live comfortably. Instead, working families existed in overcrowded, dirty, damp, and poorly ventilated premises, which was created due to a lack of space and the desire of manufacturers to maximize profits with minimal costs. In major industrial cities such as Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham, and London, a system of working estates developed in which thousands of people lived in conditions that were far from normal. These estates were crowded houses, often built quickly and without regard for building standards. These buildings provided neither adequate ventilation nor adequate lighting. It is difficult to imagine such housing for a working family with 4 to 6 children, in conditions where every day was filled with hard work and deprivation. But for most workers at the time, this was the norm. Although built to save money, such houses often housed entire families, and the living conditions were, to put it mildly, unhealthy. They were gloomy, damp, overcrowded spaces in which there was little room for privacy. The small, cramped rooms that housed several families were filled not only with people, but also with cheap, low-quality furnishings, which added to the physical discomfort. Often several generations lived in the same room, and there was no room for privacy, nor was there any opportunity for normal work, rest, or study. Even basic hygiene was impossible to maintain in such conditions. The water supply was outdated and often non-existent. Clean water was a luxury, and many working-class neighborhoods did not have access to water that was safe for drinking or washing. This, in turn, created a dangerous situation from a sanitation point of view, since all workers used the same source for drinking, washing, and doing laundry, which contributed to the spread of diseases. Despite the poverty, factory owners and owners of working-class neighborhoods did little to improve housing conditions. As profit and cost minimization were their most important criteria, they thus became part of a system that ignored people's basic needs. Workers paid for housing and workplaces that were ultimately unsafe, dusty, cold, and dirty. Houses were built from cheap materials, such as thin boards or old bricks, which could not provide adequate thermal insulation. In winter, such houses became unbearably cold, and in summer, stuffy and hot. Workers and their families had neither heating nor the means to keep warm in the winter. In addition, the lack of proper sewage in most cases meant that wastewater was discharged directly into the streets or into nearby rivers, which were then used for drinking and other purposes. Most working-class neighborhoods also lacked toilets or flush toilets. Workers often used public toilets, which were in extremely poor condition. Overcrowded streets, dirt, and garbage were constant companions of the working-class neighborhood. Sanitary conditions in these areas were terrible, which also led to epidemics of diseases. The problems with housing and hygiene were not limited to the poor quality of buildings and lack of amenities. The high population density that working-class areas faced played a major role in worsening the situation. Many people, especially in large industrial cities, were forced to live in cramped spaces. Many families occupied one or two rooms in which everyone, adults, children, and even pets, lived and slept. This made conditions for privacy and recreation impossible. There was no room for personal belongings or recreation in such houses, which further aggravated the physical and mental strain on workers. The lack of proper ventilation was also a major factor affecting the workers' health. In these cramped quarters, there was no access to fresh air, which contributed to the rapid spread of diseases. When workers went outside, they faced other problems: polluted air, emissions from factory chimneys, and constant dust that settled not only in their apartments, but also on their bodies, clothes, and food. Without proper hygiene and normal sanitation, many fell ill, but treatment was available only to a few. The workers had no way to escape this cycle. The system was closed, they lived in poor conditions, worked in difficult conditions, and their health deteriorated quickly. More often than not, even if one of the workers fell ill, they could not afford treatment. Medicines were expensive, and medical care in those areas was either unavailable or ineffective. Diseases spread quickly among residents of the working-class neighborhoods, leading to high mortality rates. By this time, there was no effective healthcare system for workers. In most cases, they turned to local herbalists or doctors who served the poor, but their services were limited. Hospitals were either expensive or simply not available in the right places, and they were usually overcrowded. As a result, workers, especially in the cities, where conditions were even more difficult, did not have sufficient medical care. This is how workers lived, and all this happened against the backdrop of growing industry and economic progress that seemed to ignore their needs. Factories and industrialization not only remained the source of productive growth, but also became the same places that supported social inequality and exploitation. The housing conditions of workers were part of this social and economic system that ignored people's basic needs and undermined their health. It was not until the late 19th century that changes in legislation began to gradually improve living conditions for workers. Building codes, housing laws, and sanitation measures began to gradually improve the situation. However, despite these changes, many workers continued to live in harsh conditions for many years. Thus, the living conditions of the workers of the 19th century were terrible and cruel. Cramped, dirty, poorly ventilated apartments became a symbol of exploitation and social injustice. Workers lived in conditions that could be considered inhuman, and this struggle for a more dignified life continued for many decades. Women in 19th century factories occupied a special place in the industrial production system, but it was an exceptionally low place, and their labor was among the most exploited. Not only did women in factories work for much lower wages than men, but they also faced even more brutal working conditions due to their gender and social status. This aspect of the work process during the Industrial Revolution can be considered one of the darkest, because despite the enormous contribution of women to the development of industry, their life in factory labor conditions was almost unbearable. Many women began working in factories as early as the early 19th century, when the factory system was just beginning to gain strength. Women, along with children, made up a significant part of the factory workforce, especially in industries such as textiles. Factories needed cheap labor, and women, who could do less physically demanding work than men, became sought-after workers. However, their work was not perceived as equal to that of men, and they received much lower wages. Women, despite the same amount of work, worked for significantly less pay than their male colleagues. This social inequality that existed in 19th century factories was also exacerbated by the fact that women often had no rights to improve their working conditions or to complain. Women in factories performed tasks that required patience and dexterity, especially in the textile manufacturing. They worked on looms, spinning machines, and other machines that required the ability to manipulate materials quickly and accurately. They often performed monotonous, repetitive work that left little room for creativity or personal initiative. In conditions of fierce competition and constant pressure from factory owners, women had no time to rest and often worked 12 to 14 hours a day. These long shifts, combined with low pay and minimal conditions for recuperation, became unbearable. In addition, factory work was extremely dangerous, and women were often exposed to injuries, cuts, and burns from machines. The machines were not equipped with protective equipment, and none of it ensured the safety of workers. For example, women could be pulled into the machines or have their arms and legs injured, and such injuries often led to amputations. Another major problem women faced in factories was the long-term exploitation of their labor force. Most women had no time to rest, as even during short breaks they had to eat modest meals in uncomfortable, cramped quarters next to the production lines. They lived in the same conditions as men, in overcrowded, dark, and poorly ventilated apartments. In these conditions, women were forced to support their families, often performing factory work and then returning home, where they also performed the roles of mother, wife, and housekeeper. Factory work became a part of their lives, leaving no room for rest, leisure, or personal space. Women in factories also faced severe social inequality. Workers were divided not only by gender, but also by status, and women generally did not have the same social protections as men. They were deprived of the opportunity to influence their working conditions, since there were no trade unions or other structures in factories that could protect their rights. Women could not afford to complain or demand improvements, since the fear of losing their job or being punished for dissatisfaction was too great. There was a myth in society at the time that women had to tolerate difficult working conditions, since their role in society was considered by most to be limited to the home and family. This situation for women in factories was extremely alarming and led to not only physical, but also psychological exhaustion. Working with machines, long shifts, lack of privacy, poor food and housing conditions. All this destroyed not only the body, but also the soul. Women were subject to depression, chronic fatigue, and nervous disorders. In addition, in difficult working conditions, women often suffered from diseases, such as respiratory diseases associated with dirty air in factories, or diseases caused by the lack of normal sanitation. Their bodies were subjected to severe physical strain, and constant stress weakened the immune system and increased susceptibility to various diseases. However, despite all the terrible working conditions, women in the factories of the 19th century played an important role in the fight for better working conditions. In the late 19th century, the first women's unions and organizations began to emerge, which began to fight for women's rights in industry. Women began to realize the need to fight for better working conditions, and although most of them did not have a voice in politics, they became an important force in the protests that later led to social reform. Every year, more and more women began to join labor movements that sought to improve working conditions for everyone, both men and women. These movements gradually led to the first laws protecting women's rights in the workplace. Laws limiting women's working hours and requiring better working conditions began to be introduced in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. However, the process was long and difficult, and it was only after many years of struggle that women began to achieve improvements. Thus, the role of women in the factories of the 19th century was not only in their direct work, but also in the fact that their work became a symbol of the struggle for workers' rights and better working conditions. These women became an important part of the history of the labor movement and played a key role in the social changes that occurred during the industrial era. Their hard work, despite merciless exploitation, became the starting point for further changes in society and labor relations, and the fight for equality and women's rights continued into the 20th century. Working in 19th century factories was not only difficult, but also extremely dangerous. The working conditions in these factories were life-threatening, and the dangers they faced on a daily basis were not just physical, but psychological as well. The machinery they worked with was unpredictable and often lacked basic safety features. Injuries were a daily reality, and many workers fell victim to dangerous production processes. There was little to no workplace safety in 19th century factories, making these places incredibly dangerous for the people who were within their walls. One of the most obvious dangers for workers was working with large and powerful mechanical devices. Most factories of the time used steam engines and looms that ran at high speeds and could cause serious injuries. For example, in textile factories, the machines could run so fast that even the slightest mistake by a worker, lack of concentration, or fatigue could lead to tragic consequences. Workers in factories often had no protection from these machines, and accidents such as being caught in the machines or having their arms or legs amputated were common. The machines appeared to be safe enough on the surface, but in reality they were deadly to workers who did not always have the necessary knowledge and experience to operate them. Injuries were not only the result of mechanical hazards, but also a direct result of inadequate safety in factories. Machines were not equipped with safety guards, and workers, especially children and women, often worked near fast-moving parts. Workers sometimes fell into machines, became victims of mechanical failures, or became stuck in parts. These injuries resulted in permanent disfigurement. Hands, feet, fingers, or eyes were often the targets of injury. In a factory environment, even a small mistake or accident could cost a person their life or health. At the same time, factories did not have adequate medical care, and often injured workers did not receive adequate care. Many died from infections related to their injuries, as they did not have access to proper treatment. These were merciless conditions, where human life was not valued. In addition, there were other hazards not directly related to the machines, but no less destructive to the health of the workers. For example, the sanitary conditions in the factory premises were extremely unfavorable. Many factories lacked proper ventilation, and the premises were filled with dust, dirt, and products of production. Workers were constantly exposed to this dust, which caused respiratory diseases such as chronic bronchitis, pneumoconiosis, a lung disease caused by inhaling dust, and other diseases that destroyed their health. The odors of chemicals used in the production process, such as oils and resins, also led to poisoning, headaches, and disruption of the normal functioning of organs. Dirt, dust, and poor ventilation in factories contributed not only to respiratory diseases, but also to skin diseases. Workers often suffered from eczema, dermatitis, and other skin diseases caused by prolonged contact with chemicals, dirt, and other irritants. In the conditions of factory life, it was almost impossible to avoid contamination, since workers could not wash or change clothes as often as necessary to prevent disease. Combined with long working hours and a lack of food, these conditions created serious health risks. Night shift work was no less of a health hazard. Many factories began working around the clock to increase productivity, which required workers to work at night. Working at night in conditions of insufficient lighting, with constant noise and without sufficient rest, contributed not only to physical exhaustion, but also to the deterioration of the mental state of workers. Night shifts were especially difficult for women and children, whose bodies were not prepared for such extreme conditions. Fatigue, sleep disturbances, and nighttime stress led to neuroses, insomnia, and even mental disorders. All these psychological and physical problems not only worsened productivity, but also contributed to the deterioration of the workers' health in the future. In addition, the constant use of heavy tools and performing monotonous work without breaks led to injuries caused by fatigue and muscle strain. Many workers suffered from back, arm, and leg pain, and chronic fatigue compromised their physical and emotional health. Workers without the right to rest were essentially trapped in a mechanical process that did not allow them to recuperate. Some workers suffered from pain in their joints, spine, and other areas of the body because long hours of work without breaks, without support from their employer, led to occupational diseases. Long hours of work at the factory were not only physical, but also psychological torture. Workers were forced to work under constant stress, as factory conditions dictated not only the work schedule, but also strict requirements for the quantity of products produced. The workday, which began at dawn and ended late at night, continued with minimal breaks, which in turn led to emotional and nervous exhaustion. These physical and psychological stresses not only destroyed health, but also caused depression and insomnia among workers. In addition, women and children working in factories faced another category of danger. Women, due to their physical condition and social status, were particularly exploited. They worked the same hours as men, but for less pay, and often had no way to complain about injustice or working conditions. Women and children worked close to powerful machines, which increased the risk of injury and various diseases. Often, it was women and children who were most vulnerable in the event of accidents and incidents in the factory. Thus, 19th century factory production was full of dangers and threats for workers. Working conditions in factories became not only a severe physical test, but also a psychological torment. Workers, forced to work 12 to 14 hours a day on dangerous machines, in terrible sanitary conditions, became victims of a system that aimed to increase profits and productivity, with minimal expenditure on the safety and health of workers. The workers' protests and strikes of the 19th century were a milestone in the history of social struggle and the development of labor rights. Despite the harshest working conditions, poverty, lack of hope for a better future, and constant exploitation, workers began to realize the need to unite to protect their interests. These protests and strikes, which arose in response to brutal exploitation, were the first steps towards improving working conditions and changing the social order. But there were severe obstacles to this, including brutal repression by factory owners and authorities, who did everything possible to suppress any attempts by workers to change their fate. Strikes began in the early 19th century when workers, fed up with harsh working conditions and low pay, began to demand change. These were hard times, and in factories, workers were forced to work 12 to 16 hours a day for little pay. However, working conditions in factories, particularly in the textile and coal industries, became intolerable, leading to workers demanding justice. At first, strikes were scattered, with workers fighting for better conditions or higher wages at the factory level. However, over time they became more intense and involved a wider range of workers, contributing to the growth of the labor movement across Britain and beyond. The main problem was that in the 19th century, workers had no rights to strike or protest against their employers. The legislation of the time was designed to protect the interests of the factory owners, not the workers. Workers who decided to go on strike were subject to brutal repression. Strikes were usually illegal, and workers who tried to organize protests risked being arrested or fired. In many cases, factory owners used their own guards or hired people to suppress any attempts at strikes. In conditions where workers did not have the right to trade unions or even the right to collective bargaining, strikes became a last resort left to them. As mass strikes began to occur, workers began to realize the power of unity. During this period, the first labor unions began to emerge, bringing together workers who were largely responsible for organizing strikes. In these unions, workers were able to openly discuss their working conditions for the first time, fighting for better conditions and fair pay. The unions, however, faced enormous resistance from employers who did not want to lose cheap workers and were opposed to any changes that would threaten their profits. In response, workers began to organize into larger, more organized groups, which contributed to the growth of social activism. One of the most striking examples of mass strikes is the Lancashire Mill Strike of 1810, which became an important event in the history of the labor movement. In response to poor working conditions and low wages, thousands of workers, including women and children, walked off the job and demanded improvements. This event became a symbol of how workers began to realize their power and the need to unite. Despite the brutal measures taken by the authorities to suppress the protests, such strikes became a regular occurrence, and workers began to fight for their rights. The movement to reduce the working day became especially important. Factory workers worked 12 to 16 hours a day, which was, of course, unbearable for many of them. Protests aimed at reducing working hours became an important part of the strikes in Britain in the 1820s. Workers demanded that their working day not exceed 10 hours, which, in their opinion, was necessary for a normal existence. Through strikes and protests, workers began to draw attention to this problem, which eventually led to changes in labor laws. An equally important moment in the history of the 19th century labor movement were the protests against child labor. Workers, realizing that factories were using children as cheap labor, began to raise this issue through strikes and protests. Child labor became one of the most flagrant forms of exploitation, and workers, realizing this injustice, began to demand legislative changes. In the struggle for children's rights in factories, strikes became an important tool for pressuring factory owners and the government. These protests eventually led to the adoption of laws regulating child labor and limiting the working day for minors. However, in the first decades of the 19th century, protests and strikes rarely brought immediate results. Workers faced stiff resistance from the authorities and factory owners. Many factories introduced special mechanisms to suppress strikes, including the creation of blacklists of those who participated in protests. Workers who were on these lists could not find work in other factories, which worsened their situation and led to social isolation. It is also worth remembering that strikes in factories were often accompanied by brutal repression by the authorities. The authorities usually used the army or police to suppress strikes, and many workers were arrested, while their families suffered from poverty and deprivation. However, despite the repression, strikes became more organized and large scale, and workers began to achieve their first victories in their struggle for justice. Workers' protests and strikes became important steps towards creating more equitable working conditions. One of the most significant achievements of the strike movement was the adoption of the Factory Safety Act in 1833. This law was the first step towards officially limiting working hours and improving working conditions, as well as recognizing workers' rights to rest and protection of their rights. However, this was only the beginning, and the workers' struggle for their rights continued. Protests and strikes became an important tool in the fight for social rights, and although they were not always successful, they became the basis for changes in labor legislation. Thus, the workers' protests and strikes of the 19th century became an important stage in the history of social progress. They became not only a struggle for better working conditions, but also a symbol of workers' aspirations for rights, justice, and social change. These protests formed the basis for future reforms and led to changes in labor legislation, which became more humane and protective of workers' interests. The first labor protection laws in the 19th century were an important step in the development of workers' rights, improving working conditions, and fighting for social justice. These laws began to appear in response to mass protests and strikes by workers, who became increasingly organized and aimed at changing brutal exploitation. Workers, faced with intolerable conditions, looking for ways to survive in the context of mass industrialization, began to realize that in order to improve their situation, not only strikes and protests were necessary, but also legislative reform that would ensure their rights and protect them from exploitation. In the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, legislators generally ignored working conditions in factories, and the laws that existed at the time generally protected the interests of factory owners rather than workers. Authorities and entrepreneurs considered workers' labor an important resource that could be used without special restrictions, including for the most efficient extraction of profit. Workers, however, living in harsh conditions, gradually began to realize that without changes in legislation and without the creation of effective labor protection mechanisms, it was impossible to improve their lives. It was this realization that became the catalyst for the first wave of labor reforms, which were made possible only by the persistence of workers and activists, the fight for equality and justice. The earliest and most visible step towards protecting workers' rights was the Factory Act of 1833, which was a landmark moment in British labor law. This act limited the working hours of women and children in factories. Until this time, children working in factories had to endure intolerable conditions, working 12 or even 14 hours a day. The 1833 Act set maximum working hours for minors and women, which was an important step towards improving working conditions for the most vulnerable in society. However, it is important to note that this act did not apply to men and did not affect the majority of adult workers, which confirms the fact that even in the early days of labor protection, laws were still imperfect and limited in their impact. In addition, the 1833 Act obliged factory owners to provide workers with periodic rest and lunch breaks, which in turn was a step towards improving conditions in factories. Until then, workers worked without respite, without sufficient time for rest, which led to great physical and mental fatigue. This law was the first official recognition that labor should not only be effective, but that a person working in a factory should have the right to rest, normal working conditions, and minimum safety guarantees. Subsequently, these changes became the basis for new laws that gradually improved working conditions in factories. The next significant step was the Child Labor Act of 1842, which significantly restricted the working conditions of children in coal mines and other dangerous industries. Children who worked in mines from an early age were particularly exposed to danger, They worked in dark, damp mines where there was a high risk of injury and illness from exposure to harmful elements. This law was a response to ongoing protests and public concern about the use of children in such dangerous working conditions. Although the law was an important step in the fight for children's rights, it did not solve all the problems associated with child labor and did not cover children working in other industries. But it was the first real step towards banning child labor in dangerous industries. An important step towards improving working conditions for women and children was the Factory Safety Act of 1847, which set a working day limit for women and adolescents at 10 hours. This law was passed after mass protests by women began in the country, who were subjected to enormous physical and psychological pressure while working in factories. They worked 12 to 16 hours a day, which significantly worsened their health. The Act of 1847 was a solution that guaranteed a reduction in working hours for women, as well as the beginning of the fight for healthier and safer working conditions. Although the law was far from ideal and did not cover all workers, it became an important signal for further social reforms and broader changes in legislation. One of the reasons for the passage of these laws was the growing public pressure caused by both workers' protests and support from the enlightened part of society. Activists and political leaders concerned about the brutal exploitation of workers began to publicly advocate for better working conditions and for the protection of the rights of women and children. Over time, especially after the 1840s, it became clear that the factory acts and restrictions on working hours not only increased the welfare of workers, but also contributed to improving productivity. These laws not only protected the health and safety of workers, but also served as a basis for a more equitable distribution of profits between workers and manufacturers. During the second half of the 19th century, labor protection laws continued to evolve. For example, in 1867, the Factories Act was passed, which expanded workers' rights by regulating not only working hours, but also working conditions for a wider range of workers. This law was an important step in creating regulations that required employers to ensure workplace safety and provide their workers with minimum conditions for normal work and rest. Also during this period, the fight for an increase in the minimum wage began, which led to the creation of the first trade unions, which began to actively fight for better working conditions and higher wages. Labor protection laws not only improved the physical conditions of workers, but also contributed to the growth of consciousness among workers. These laws became an important tool in the fight for social justice, human rights, and equality, ensuring that work would be done not only efficiently, but also with respect for workers' rights. Their passage was the result of years of struggle by workers, activists, and enlightened politicians and cultural figures. These reforms ensured workers access to a minimum level of protection and laid the foundation for further changes aimed at improving the quality of life and work in industrial society. With each new labor protection law passed in Britain and other industrialized countries, workers became increasingly aware of their rights and protections against exploitation. These laws were the first sparks of change that eventually led to the modern safety, social protection, and labor standards we see today. The evolution of factory production in the 19th century was an integral part of the global changes that were taking place in the economy, technology, and social structure of society. This process was not instantaneous, and behind each stage of industrialization, there were decades of intense labor and social conflict, innovation, and rapid change. Throughout the century, factory production underwent profound changes, from the earliest machines that were only modest improvements on old methods to the creation of high-tech enterprises, capable of producing huge volumes of products at minimal cost. However, these changes were not always aimed at improving conditions for workers, and in many cases, they only increased the exploitation of workers. To begin with, it is worth considering how the factory itself and work processes changed in the early 19th century. When the Industrial Revolution was just gaining momentum, factories were fairly primitive, albeit powerful for their time, structures. Most factories of that time were powered by water or steam engines, which replaced older production methods associated with manual labor or the use of animal power. During this period, the mechanisms in factories were relatively simple, and their installations were not distinguished by high productivity. In most cases, workers in factories were engaged in monotonous manual work, despite the appearance of the first mechanical devices, such as spinning machines and the first steam engines. workers were still dependent on their hands, and machines only sped up the process. However, as technology advanced and new types of machines were introduced, factory production underwent enormous changes. In the 1830s, steam engines, perfected by James Watt and other engineers, became the primary engine of industry. These machines allowed factories to operate around the clock and were not dependent on natural factors such as wind or water, dramatically increasing production capacity. The rapid expansion of railroads and coal mines provided unprecedented access to the energy and resources needed to run factories. As a result of industrial growth, factories became not only economic powerhouses, but also important elements of urban life, providing jobs for thousands of people despite terrible working conditions. Over time, the process of mechanization became more and more complex. Weaving machines, spinning machines, and various mechanisms for processing materials became faster, more precise, and more reliable. Gradually, factories turned into high-tech enterprises, where each worker performed his or her task while remaining part of the overall production process. However, this process did not always lead to improved working conditions. On the contrary, with the increasing mechanization of work tasks, their work became even more monotonous, and the conditions became increasingly harsh. Manufacturers, seeking to increase their profits, reduced the cost of labor at the expense of labor, which led to a further deterioration in the workers' situation. In fact, improvements in technology and mechanization of factory production often meant even greater exploitation of workers. This was especially true for women and children, who made up a large part of the factory workforce. Technological advances required more hands, making factory jobs even more overcrowded. Women and children did the same work as men, but for less pay, and their working conditions were often even worse. Factory machinery became increasingly dangerous, and worker injuries increased despite increased production capacity. By the end of the 19th century, a new type of factory emerged in industrial countries, where technology allowed for faster and lower-cost production. These factories were already using electric motors, which significantly improved working conditions. Machines became safer and more reliable, and the production structure itself began to shift from older methods to more modern ones. At the same time, despite these technical improvements, workers continued to work in harsh conditions. The working day continued to last 12 to 16 hours, and in some cases, even longer. From time to time, all this led to an increase in social discontent and protests among workers, which became the cause of strikes and protests. In 19th century factories, production was organized to minimize costs by using cheap labor and machinery that allowed for the production of goods in huge quantities. This overproduction of production not only affected the lives of workers, but also had environmental consequences. Environmental pollution was one of the side effects of the growth of factory production, as factories emitted huge amounts of carbon dioxide and other harmful substances into the atmosphere. Dirty and unfavorable working conditions, combined with the harmful effects of a polluted environment, created conditions for the growth of diseases among workers and also accelerated the degradation of their health. Workers began to fall ill from constant work in polluted areas, suffering from chronic diseases such as pneumoconiosis, respiratory diseases, and cardiovascular disorders. At the same time, factories and their owners also began to realize that further improvements in production required not only an increase in the volume of goods produced, but also ensuring worker safety. At this time, the first signs of reforms began to appear that concerned workplace safety. Some of the large factory corporations began to implement methods that improved working conditions, for example, creating simple ventilation systems and protecting workers from polluted atmospheres, as well as introducing certain safety standards. However, these changes were more the exception than the norm, and were distributed mainly to the largest and most profitable factories. With the development of factory production in the 19th century, new forms of production emerged, such as the assembly line, which became the basis for mass production of goods. First developed in 1913 by Henry Ford in his car factories, the system was the result of the latest advances in mechanization and technology. Assembly line production allowed for significant increases in efficiency, reducing the amount of labor time required to produce a single unit of output. But, as with previous stages of industrialization, it also led to further depersonalization of labor. workers became part of the machine, their activities reduced to performing uniform operations devoid of any creative process. Thus, the evolution of factory production in the 19th century, despite advances in technology, did not always lead to improvements in the lives of workers. While mechanization allowed goods to be produced more quickly and at a lower cost, it also led to increased exploitation of workers. The use of new technologies and increased efficiency in production increased the profits of factory owners, but did not improve working conditions or create decent jobs for the workers themselves. This evolution of factory production, despite its achievements, remained a driving force for social and economic change, requiring not only new technologies but also new views on the social structure. The legacy of 19th century factory work has proven to be multifaceted and multi-layered. Not only has this legacy left a deep mark on the history of labor and the labor movement, but it has also had a significant impact on modern forms of production, social and economic structures, and the very perception of work in society. And while the factory revolution led to significant improvements in living conditions in industrialized countries, it also brought with it a whole new set of challenges that continue to shape labor and social relations around the world today. One of the most visible aspects of the legacy of factory labor was the development of an industrial economy in which factories became the main engine of production. The Industrial Revolution, by its scale and significance, radically changed the structure of the economy from an agrarian to an industrial one. This change was caused not only by new technologies but also by the creation of new factory structures that required huge amounts of labor. People began to move en masse to cities, where new factories and plants were built. This led to urbanization, a change in the social structure of society, and the emergence of new social strata, such as the working class. However, in this process, workers became hostage to new working conditions, which, although they increased production capacity, did not provide basic protection for the worker himself. The rise of factory work also changed the concept of work. Unlike traditional craft work, factory work became completely mechanized, monotonous, and standardized. Workers in 19th century factories were not masters of their craft, as they were in traditional craft production. They became simply part of the system, performing monotonous tasks on a conveyor belt or machine, with no ability to influence the end result. The workday became long, and working conditions became difficult. These changes in the perception of work made it more depersonalized, which, on the one hand, allowed for increased production volumes, but on the other, left workers without the opportunity for self-development or influence over the end result of their work. One of the most tragic aspects of the legacy of factory work is that, despite the enormous contribution workers made to industrial progress, their living and working conditions remained extremely poor for much of the 19th century. It was only towards the end of the century that the first laws protecting workers' rights, regulating working hours, and creating basic safety conditions began to emerge. However, until then, factories were veritable factories for the exploitation of human labor, where workers, including women and children, toiled in dangerous and grueling conditions, risking their lives for minimal pay. Working families lived in appalling conditions, crowded, dirty, unsanitary apartments that contributed to the spread of disease, while the heavy physical labor and lack of rest led to early death. Over time, activists and labor movements began to fight for better working conditions. Trade unions, which began to emerge in the late 19th century, became an important tool for workers to improve their living and working conditions. Initially, such organizations faced stiff resistance from employers and authorities, but gradually they became important allies in the fight for workers' rights. These unions fought for shorter working hours, better wages, and minimum safety and health standards. This fight became the basis for further social and political reforms that in the 20th century led to the creation of a system of social guarantees available to all workers, not just the wealthy. However, even with the first labor laws, conditions in factories remained far from ideal. The expected results of industrialization, improved quality of life, and better working conditions were primarily limited to large factory corporations that had the resources to implement new technologies and improve safety. Workers in small factories and plants continued to work under the same conditions as decades before. In some industries, such as coal and textiles, working conditions remained dangerous and the workdays were still grueling. However, despite the difficult conditions, the work carried out in the 19th century became the basis for further improvements in the lives of workers in the 20th century. The laws governing labor continued to improve. With the development of the labor movement, the growth of trade unions, and the active participation of the government in regulating labor relations, labor standards gradually improved and labor safety requirements became stricter. Today, labor rights are protected not only at the level of national laws, but also at the international level. The United Nations and the International Labor Organization, ILO, are actively working to improve working conditions around the world. However, despite these achievements, the legacy of 19th century factory work continues to influence modern society and production. We still face problems related to the exploitation of workers in some countries, the violation of their rights, and the lack of fairness in the distribution of the wealth produced with their help. Modern corporations continue to use the model of mass production, but working conditions in factories in some countries still fall short of human dignity. Issues of labor rights, the rights of women and children, and safety in the workplace continue to be important topics for public debate. The rise of the factory and its legacy, both good and bad, laid the foundation for today's labor standards, including modern technology and a fairer approach to workers' rights. Many of the same problems that workers faced in the 19th century remain relevant today. But it was because of those hard and painful years of workers' struggle, through protests and strikes, that we have made significant improvements in labor rights. These struggles have led to changes that have created a system of rights that protects workers and helped build a fair and secure future for all.